you guys want to keep on with this, or just let me tell you how it ends and we'll just move on to something easy? No? If I compared it to like college level courses, this is not a 101 course. This is a graduate study course, and I might relate it to maybe the parable of the cell phone, the smartphone. And some people have seen a smartphone and say, it's evil, I'm not going to have anything to do with it, which is how some people deal with the scriptures, skeptics and non-believers. But there are some people who have a cell phone, and you know what they actually use it for? To make telephone calls. Can you believe that? And then there are people who use a smartphone for not only phone calls, but they use it for their internet, they use it for taking pictures, they use it for their stereo, and on it goes. And then there's the fourth class who actually know how to change things in their cell phone. They know what's all, if you go to your, if I were to go to your, no, I can't even find it, the settings, they would know all these settings mean, okay? There's some people who understand all of that. And so I use the same thing with the Bible. There's some people who, Bible's not for me. Then there are people who use it to know it's a good life. And then some people who can read and study and understand. There's other people who know actually how to really dig deep into it. And that's the writer of the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 6. And when he says, you know, by this time, so I really want to tell you about this guy named Melchizedek. But I can't, because by this time you ought to be teachers. You should know this stuff. It says, but you need the elementary things all over. But none of us are that, because all of us have been reading and studying the Bible, haven't we? Amen? All right. So when we read this, we can understand. By the way, I'm not going to tell you which one of those in the cell phone I am. Revelation chapter 12. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant, was crying out in birth pains, and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, and 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Wow. Anybody got an idea what all that means? Well, it's right there. I read it. English Standard Version. Some of you use the King James, some of you use the NIV, some other versions. What's it all mean? Some believe that with the end of chapter 11, that the Bible sort of goes, or this book of Revelation goes back and begins to tell the story again. But it really isn't. It really is a continuation, because the last part of chapter 11 says in verse 19, says, then God's temple in heaven was open, and the ark of the covenant was seen within his temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. When those things happen, what's usually about to happen? Something big is about to happen. Okay? In the Old Testament, when the law was about to give it, and Moses was up on the mountain, you read a lot of these things happening. And we're going to read about this happening in the book of Revelation. Whenever something like this happens, something big is about to happen. We go back to the end of chapter 10, and remember that John was given this little scroll, and he says, eat it. And we know that's from the Old Testament, Ezekiel. Ezekiel was told the same thing. I want you to eat this scroll. What it represents is I'm going to give you the word of God, and you're going to prophesy. And that's what he said. He says, and you must again prophesy about many peoples, nations, languages, and kings. So he's talking about these, which when he talks about peoples, languages, nations, languages, and kings, they're not talking about Israel, they're talking about the world. So he's going to make these prophecies about the world. Now we come to chapter 12. Here's where the prophecies are going to begin. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun. Who is this woman? And remember, we're talking in big symbolic language. Israel. If you went into where they're having class, right in the kitchen, right where you serve the food, the little door comes up, and right there, and there's a, Rita, what would you call that? Where's Rita at? Right there. What do you call that? You made the timeline. It's your big poster where you have all the things of how God has. A diagram, yeah. Talk about senior moments. But and you see God, how he has worked and portrayed it through the Old Testament. And so you see, and the Bible is not a history of the world per se to say, well, how about the Chinese, or how about those in India, or how about those down in South? No. The Old Testament is showing the path that God has for your salvation and my salvation, and how he has dealt with people. So this woman here is, we're not talking about an individual woman. And it's not Mary. It is not Mary, the mother of Jesus. How do we know that? Because you think, well, it's talking about, was she was pregnant, she gave birth. Did Mary give birth to Jesus? Yes. The answer is yes. Okay. But here it's talking about a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Where have we heard this language before? Yes. You have. It is one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis. Who had a dream like that? Joseph. Joseph has a dream. And he has this dream that the sun and the moon and the stars are going to bow down to him. So we see that this is representing something bigger than just Mary. Okay? This woman clothed with the sun is talking about the people of God. Down through history, the people of God. And she was pregnant and crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And I think that's good language, because if you look at the struggle, go through the Old Testament, and dare I say even read the genealogies, and it'll bring to mind all of the struggles. From Abraham being told, listen, you've got to leave Ur of the Chaldees. And go to a place that I'm going to show you. And what did Abraham know about this place? Well, he Googled it to find out where he was going, right? He didn't know a thing about this place. And the writer of the book of Hebrews tells us as much. By faith, he left that land. We read about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph and the 12 patriarchs. We read about all these things that are done. And it is a struggle to bring this in. But remember, this is the promise that was made in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, that through your seed. Now, Satan's going to bruise your heel, and we know that it's going to be Satan. I give that away ahead of time because later on it's going to tell us that's who it is. It's going to bruise your heel, but you're going to bruise his head. You're not going to be victorious over this. Through pain, all of the plan of God has come forth, hasn't it? It wasn't just a given. Miraculous, providential, however it was, this came about. Another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns on his head, and 7 diadems. Who's the dragon? Evil or Satan? I'll give you a hint. It tells us in this chapter who it is. You don't have to guess. It tells you. If you go further down in the chapter, it tells you. Describes him perfectly. Oh, where is he? Verse 9, there it is. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil, Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. Okay? So that's the description. That's who this is. Anybody not understand so far? It begins to unfold, and it's a lot more obvious than you think. And his tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore the child, he might devour it. Now we go back to Moses when he was born. And Pharaoh finds out about these children being born, and he's worried that they are going to become too powerful. So what does he do? He wants to kill them when they're born. What does he tell the midwives? Yeah, the women are too fast. He tells the midwives, kill them. So we understand this language, that what he wants to do, the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore the child, he might devour it. And when else did this happen?
The Holocaust.
Holocaust. What Holocaust?
In World War II.
Nope. We're still in ancient history. Herod. What did Herod do when he found out that a king was born? The wise men, how many wise men were there? We don't know. We don't know. That's always a trick question. Won't be on the final exam, though. And the wise men come to him and say, we've heard this king's been born. Herod finds this out. What's he want to do? Wants to kill them. Okay? All right? Who is controlling Herod? Who is controlling Pharaoh? Who is controlling all of these people that want to kill God's people? Ultimately, it is the dragon. Ultimately, it is the dragon. Because this woman who is pregnant and crying out to birth pains, and this isn't talking about that 24, 48, 30, 40, 72 hours of when Jesus is about to be born. Not those labor pains, but the labor pain of bringing that Messiah into the world. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. I wish we knew who that child was. Who is this child? It's a mystery. We're talking the 21st century, aren't we? Oh, it's the Son of God. Yes, of course it is. Of course it is. There's no mystery. And how do we know that it is Messiah? Verse 5, she bore a male child who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. You know your Old Testament, don't you? Because you know that we read in Psalm chapter 2, writing in verse 7, I will declare the decree, the Lord has made me. You are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and you shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. Here's the prophecy. What does it mean to rule with a rod of iron? Absolute authority. Absolute authority. We can boil it right down to there. In chapter 2 Revelation, beginning verse 26, he who overcomes and keeps my works until the end, to him I will give power over the nations. He shall rule them with a rod of iron. They shall be dashed to pieces like the potter's vessel. Again, quoting from Psalm chapter 2. So we know without a doubt exactly who this child is. It is not somebody in the future. It is not the Antichrist. It is not the New World Order ruler or anything. It's talking about Messiah. No doubt about it. Absolutely without argument. Yes, he will. Okay? And her child was caught up to God and his throne. And remember, we are talking in symbols here. Okay, so the symbols are, who was it that brought Messiah? When we read your genealogy in Matthew 1 and Luke 3, the genealogy, that is that thread that passes through the Old Testament, passes through the patriarchal age, it passes through the Mosaic age, and God made sure. Why didn't God destroy everybody? I mean every last person in the flood. There'd be no thread. He made a promise in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15 that from your seed will come this. He can't break his promise. He cannot lie. And so all of this woman is God's people who brought about Messiah. That's why it's so important when they give the genealogy of this, that it had to come through that, had to be that woman. Okay, the woman representing Israel. Pardon?
Adam's wife. They trace all the genealogies in the Gospels, traces it all the way back to Adam.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And beginning there, that thread is woven all the way down, and that is the representative of the woman here that's being talked about. It's not one woman, it's not one person, but it is representative of what God has done to preserve that, bringing it to birth. That promise that was made to Eve, but promise that was made to mankind. That was the promise made, is that through her seed would come. Okay? Still not clear, is it? It is clear? This is yes, that's no. This is, I have no idea what you're talking about. We only got half hour, so I can get out of here and get to Applebee's. Yes, and for God, He took His time through this. Cracker Barrel. I'm sorry, it's Cracker Barrel now. If we go to Chick-fil-A today, I'm treating. Okay, but we also have this vision when he says, and the child was caught up to God and to His throne. When did this happen?
The end of the couple of the Gospels.
Okay. He's caught up to God. And what happened? What happened in that moment when he was caught up to God? Let's read from, turn to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel has this vision of exactly this part of the verse. But her child was caught up to God and to His throne. Daniel chapter 7, beginning in 13. And Daniel has this vision. Daniel 7, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel. There it is. Okay. Whew. Daniel 7:13. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man. And who is he talking about, the Son of Man? What did Jesus call himself? Without exception, Jesus never called himself the Son of God. He called himself the Son of Man. One like the Son of Man, coming in with the clouds of heaven, came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion, glory, and kingdom, that all peoples, nations, languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one which shall not be destroyed. And if that's the only verse in Daniel, you're probably scratching your head and saying, when? It's the same thing that Nebuchadnezzar had the dream, and Daniel interprets it. He says, in the days of those kings, Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44, I will set up a kingdom. And what did he say about that kingdom? A, it could be destroyed. B, it will never be destroyed. It'll never be destroyed. This is when Jesus was given the kingdom. Right here in Daniel chapter 7, and what it's referring to here in Revelation chapter 12. Child who is caught up to God and to His throne. That's a lot to take in doctrinally, isn't it? He receives this kingdom. Let's see. Acts chapter 1, verse 9. Now when he had spoken these things while they watched, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. That's what Daniel is talking about. And the Ancient of Days is who? It's God, who would eventually be known as God the Father. He's caught up to there. And if we had read in Psalm 110, sit at my feet until I make your enemies my footstool. He has given this kingdom. And for us, when he gives this kingdom 40 days after he's risen from the dead, 10 days later, what happens on the day of Pentecost? The church is established. And the church is also known as the kingdom. Okay? And that is so hard for people to grasp. But Jesus said, and I keep saying this over and over, and so that we can grasp it, in Mark chapter 9 and verse 1, he said, some of you standing here will not see death until they see the kingdom of God coming with power. Now we have a real choice to make. Either they're all still alive, or the kingdom came in their lifetime. Which one are you going to choose? Are we still waiting for that kingdom to be established? No. The kingdom was given. Daniel sees this vision in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. He comes up to the Ancient of Days, and Psalm 110 is really what it's talking about. Sit here at my on this throne until I make your enemies your footstool. Right there. The kingdom is the church.
Was it Psalm 1:7, did you say?
Psalm 110. Psalm 110. The kingdom and the church are the same thing. When was the church established? Now, if you ask some people, they'll say that John the Baptist established the church. If John the Baptist established the church, then why did Jesus say, I will, future tense, I will build my church? It's still in the future. And he says, I will, future tense, give you the keys of the kingdom. And the keys of the kingdom are what? The gospel. How does one get into the kingdom? By obedience to the gospel. There's a lot of doctrine in here, so you can preach a lot from the book of Revelation because it's things that we believe in that have already been taken place in the New Testament. Now there's an eternal kingdom. Now, there's still a little confusion. Is Jesus going to come back again? Yes. And Peter says that when he comes back again, all of the elements are going to be dissolved. Now, I don't know what it's going to look like when all of the elements are going to be dissolved, but I can tell you, everything's going to be destroyed.
You don't want to be here.
No, you don't want to be here. When he comes back, all the elements are going to be dissolved in his second coming. So the idea that Jesus came back when Jerusalem was destroyed, he came back in judgment with them, but not physically. But he will come back physically, and we shall meet him in the air. Not here. Paul says we're going to meet him in the air. Paul says in Ephesians, which he worked in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in heavenly places. He's describing exactly what John is seeing here in the book of Revelation. It says when he was caught up to God and to his throne. Colossians 3:1. If then you are raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. Over and over. Hebrews 1:3, Hebrews 1:13, Hebrews 8:1, Hebrews 10:12, Hebrews 12:2, 1 Peter 3:22, all say that Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. And it happened when he was raised up into heaven, and the disciples looked, and what did the angels say? Why are you standing here looking? In the same way, you'll see him come back. And Paul describes that when you see him coming in the clouds. We'll meet him in the air. 1 Thessalonians 4. Yep. Absolutely. Okay. And the woman fled into the wilderness where where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,220 days. There are 4 terms that are used for describing a specific period of time in the Old Testament, book of Daniel, and here in Revelation. The first one is a time, times, and half a time. And a time refers to a year, and times refers to 2 years. So you have a time and a times, and if a time is 1 year, how long is half a times? Add those up and you have 3.5 years, okay? The next one we have is 42 months. How long is 42 months? 3.5 years. How long is 1,260 days? 3.5 years. They all mean the same thing here. They're referring not to, if I were to count off 1,260 days from here, which is 3.5 years, which is 42 months, which is, there's one more term that I'm thinking of, and I'd say, okay, I'm going to count from this day, and then I'd mark it off on the calendar whenever it occurs, and 3.5 years from now would be 2025, 2026, 2027, sometime in 2027. What if it's a leap year? That's a good point. Did they have leap years then? I'm sorry. The Jewish calendar only had 360 days. So he says this 1,260 days. Is he talking a literal time, or is it a time when he says that you're going to be persecuted for 1,260 days? You're going to be persecuted for 42 months. You're going to be persecuted for 3.5 years. What does that mean? Long time, but not forever. Look in the context of what they talk about. And it says, where a place is prepared by God. And what does a wilderness represent? A desert place? Away from, nope, not away from God. The wilderness is not necessarily a desert, although it does take in the desert. A wilderness is a place simply where people don't live. And they had a wilderness, and we look at, we've watched some of the geography videos, and they look, they're just deserted. People don't live there. John the Baptist went into the wilderness. Jesus went into the wilderness for how many days? 40 days. Who else in the Old Testament went into the wilderness? The Israelites. Okay? Where did they get their food? And who provided it for them? So when the Jews read this, and the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God, they would immediately have known, oh, the Israelites were in the wilderness, and who provided for them? At the end, God tells them, what happened to your shoes all this time? They didn't wear out. What happened to your clothes? They didn't wear out. Where did your food come from? Came from the heavens. One place in the Psalms calls manna calls the food of angels, probably because it comes from heaven. But a place prepared by God in which she is nourished for 1,260 days. For all the time that she's under this persecution. Not forever, but for 1,260 days. God is going to take care of them. He's going to nourish them. Exactly, the amount of time that it takes. But in all of that time, and if I were talking in terms of something that's going to last forever, I would use a term like, symbolically and figuratively, I would use the term 1,000 years. I don't know where I'm at right now. I'm in the book of Revelation, chapter 12. I'm glad you brought me back there, though. And so when it says, and the woman fled into the wilderness, into this place to where she's being persecuted. She's being chased out of that. And remember the persecution. We begin in the book of Acts, and predominantly, who persecutes the church in the book of Acts? The Jews. We do have a little bit, because Herod kills James. And why does Herod kill James? To please the Jews. Then he turns around and puts Peter in prison thinking, oh, they like this. But he's not doing it to persecute the Jews. He's doing it, or persecute the Christians. He's doing it to please the Jews. There's a big difference in that. But it is going to come to the time, and when we get into chapter 13, which will be there in about 4 months, we are going to have to know the history of the Jews. And when does the persecution of the Jews, if you know your Roman history, when does the persecution of the Jews, of the Christians begin by the Romans? Truly, in its beginning. And you'll know it when I tell you, because I'm going to tell you about a guy that fiddled. Nero. Nero and Tacitus, the considered by many to be the greatest Roman historian of all time, said that Nero blamed the Christians for the fire that burned down Rome. He says, boy, they're such bad people. I wish somebody would do something. He's emperor. What is he going to do? He's going to start to persecute them. We know, perhaps, the real reason. Why did Nero, if Nero started that fire and blamed it on the Christians, why did Nero burn Rome? That's the great mystery. Many people believe that Nero, and this is speculation, do not chisel this in stone, Nero burned down Rome so that he could rebuild it in his own vision. How's that? Nero was the emperor of Rome from AD 54 to 68. He was just a teenager when he became the emperor. He was eventually, a couple of years after the fire, he was declared an enemy of Rome, and he committed suicide in 68 AD. That'll be on the test. Somebody rang the bell. Oh, we got lots of time. Now, war, verse 7. Revelation chapter 12, Grace. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, and here it is described, that ancient serpent, that's how we know who the dragon is, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world, he was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. Now what we want to know is, when did this war happen? And why did CNN not cover it? Oh, that's right, CNN wasn't there. When does this war take... I'm going to tell you exactly when it happened. But what are some of the choices that we have for when this war was fought?
Was the dragon a real thing?
Was the dragon? What does the dragon represent? And who is it? It's Satan. Yep. When did this war happen? Before, how do you know that? You have no idea, nor does anyone else, because that's a widely held belief. Now, if it happened before the world was formed, how did they get thrown down here? You can't throw them down to something that hasn't been created yet. Gabe, did you have your hand up? Who else did I see with a hand up? When did this happen? The clue is right here in verse 10. I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. Okay?
God said, go forth and multiply, fill up the earth and have dominion over it. He gave that command to Adam and Eve.
Okay?
They were supposed to be in charge of planet Earth.
Okay? That's a good guess. When, we already read it in verse 5. We're reading it again when he says, in a loud voice, now. When did salvation come down? Nope. What did verse 5? And the child was caught up to God in his throne. When Jesus arose and went, and God says, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. That's when Jesus began to rule. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who's called the devil and Satan, deceiver of the whole world. What does Satan do? What did Satan do? What did Satan do to Job? He goes before God and says, he accused him. He is the accuser of the brethren. Can he accuse us anymore? No. No, he cannot. Who is our intercessor? Who presents us faultless before the throne? Why do we beat ourselves up over being sinners? Because we don't believe that Christ is interceding for us and presenting us perfect. You have been washed. You have been cleansed. Do we still sin? Yeah. But no longer do those sins make it before God the Father. Why? Because we have that intercessor. Not only Christ, but who else is our intercessor? The Holy Spirit. Romans tells us that. This war that is not a physical war. The only bloodshed in this war was the blood of the Lamb. Now, read it real carefully. It didn't happen before time because the world wasn't there. But when he says, now the salvation and the power of the kingdom of God and the authority of Christ have come. When did that authority come? When he went to heaven, when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places, where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God, sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Who is seated at the right hand of the throne of majesty in the heavens, sat down at the right hand. Who has gone into heaven is at the right hand of God. Angels and authorities and powers having been made subject to him. Peter makes it perfectly clear. There's absolutely no other way to understand this than what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 22. Read it. He went and sat down at the right hand of God, and it says, at that point, angels and authorities and powers having been made subject to him. We don't know what it looked like, but we know that the victory was won, and that point of which the great dragon was thrown down. Now, war arose in heaven, and we can go on and we can look at something like the Lord of the Rings or Star Wars and this great big battle of evil. But it says, it's all right there and tells you the moment that Satan lost the battle. And went to heaven. And technically all that, but when he goes to heaven, he is given that throne.
When Christ died, didn't he actually put out hell?
He went to the realm of the dead. When it says that his spirit preached to those in the days of Noah, where did we read of Moses? We read of Moses, I think I read it in the sermon today, that Moses, we're going to run way over, aren't we? But in the book of Hebrews. And it talks about that Spirit of Christ, where he considered that to be greater than the treasures of Egypt.
So today Satan no longer has acceptance in heaven like he did with Job. He went before the throne of God and said, what did you do? Satan can't do that anymore, right?
Correct. He can no longer accuse us. His power has been taken away. And we'll read that when it says that he was bound for... No longer? No. To answer it simply, no. It is. It is. And he's the accuser. But how can he accuse us? When Paul says in Romans chapter 8 and verse 1, therefore there is no longer condemnation.
But won't there become a time when he will be released for a short period?
We'll talk about that when we get to it. You can't, because you have to work up to that. Because if I tell you what it means now, you'll spend the rest of this saying, well, that can't mean this here, that can't mean that there. But here, when you talk about the war that rose in heaven, and Satan was cast down, when was that ultimate authority given to Christ? What did Daniel say? Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, languages should serve him. That's the vision that Daniel has about this moment when Christ ascends up into heaven, into the clouds. No, the realm of the dead. He descended into Hades. There's a big difference. Read Acts chapter 2, and Peter describes this, that the place that he went to, he says, I can tell you that David is still in his tomb, but it was prophesied that he would not leave his body to decay in the grave. So this place that they talk about that Jesus spent 3 days preaching to the people back in Noah's day, no, the Spirit of Christ was preaching through Noah. The Spirit of Christ, not Christ himself. Jesus did not go back to that time, and because if he did, that would be called, what's the term I'm looking for? Pardon? Yeah, time traveling. But the Spirit of Christ, and Peter talks about this Spirit of Christ that went to preach in his letter. It's the Spirit of Christ. It is the words that were used, and the Spirit of Christ was condemning evil. Wow, did you think we would go into that today? 1 Peter 3:19.
By whom also he went and preached to the spirits in prison, who formerly were disobedient. This is talking about Christ.
Mm-hmm. And some people will say, well, he must have went to purgatory. But he didn't. It is the Spirit of Christ that went there. Whew. Okay. Go home and study up on it.
Can we do a review? Can we do a review?
No, once we move past it, we can never go back for a preview. Go back for a review.
God bless you.